minutes to log in and join us. I can see people arriving already. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Maybe while people are filing in, I'll just I'll set the scene for today's session. If you don't know us, we're CX Partners. We're a user-centered design team within Sopra Steria, and you'll hear from two Stews today. I'm Stu Charlton, and I lead the work we do for financial services businesses. And we use research and design to help those firms set better visions and to improve their services to make them work better for their customers. And this is the first in a series of 2 webinars. We've designed them to help you make your communications easier for your customers to understand. This first one is about how to test consumer understanding, and the second one's about how to improve it. That other one is in 2 weeks. It's on Wednesday, the 14th of June. You don't need to write that down now. We'll remind you about it later. And both these sessions have got a financial services focus, and because that's my sector, and also really because it's such an important issue. We all need financial services to function in society, but they're just really complicated. And most of us have limited knowledge, interest, confidence, and time. That said, consumer understanding is important in other sectors too, and the approach we'll describe today could be applied to any consumer-facing materials. So my colleague Stuart Tayler will take you into those details, and I'm just teeing things up for him. So some quick housekeeping. The session will be about 35 minutes long. We're recording it, and it's a one-way webinar, and that means no one can see you or hear you. But we'd love your questions and comments, and you should be able to share them using Slido. The button for that should pop up. Please feel free to ask questions using your name, or you can do it anonymously if you'd rather, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the session. And finally, if you'd like to turn on closed captions, you can find that in the bottom left corner of your screen. Okay, so let's get started. So it's nearly 2 years since the Consumer Duty deadline. That's why we're all here. And since then, you might have heard some different headlines, more recently in particular, about the Chancellor asking the FCA to boost growth and relaxing regulations. And you might wonder, is the pendulum swinging back towards growth and away from consumer protection? And therefore, does consumer understanding still matter? Well, if you've watched any user research recently, you will know the answer to that. Here are a few quotes I've picked from a recent project where we were checking whether consumers understood a letter that they'd been sent. This is what we heard. It's all banking talk. They're talking to each other. You're blinding me with science. Here we go again. Okay, well, I've read all that and I haven't got a clue. So yes, consumer understanding still matters, it seems to us. Many people are still struggling to make informed, effective decisions and act in their interests. And these risks of harm are foreseeable if you use the right methods to look. People are making decisions they faintly understand and crossing their fingers and hoping for the best. And many decide not to bother, and that has consequences too. So the latest Financial Lives survey data from the FCA shows that 14% of UK adults had no general insurance or protection products. And meanwhile, Boring Money research from last year proposed that 12.5 million adults aren't getting financial advice because they don't see the value or they don't trust advisors. And the result of that is that there are billions of pounds in savings that could be invested. So those people aren't planning for their future and may face a crunch at retirement. And if we want to make people in either of these situations to feel confident and engaged enough to take action themselves, then we've just got to make it easier for them to understand their options. Last week, the FCA's Joanna Legg spoke at a Plain Numbers webinar, which was excellent. I recommend you watch it if you weren't there. She presented some more Financial Lives survey data, which validated what we see in our qualitative research, including that 1 in 7 UK adults have a reading ability of a 9 to 11-year-old, and that 1 in 3 have low financial numeracy skills, which makes it hard for them to understand basic concepts like interest and inflation. And someone in the comments on that webinar asked Joanna if there's a definition of good enough. And of course, the answer was no, and it really couldn't be. And the message is clear from the regulator. It's definitely about continuous improvement, partly because the world keeps changing. So I asked, is the pendulum swinging away from consumer protection? Well, conventional wisdom suggests that they're in opposition. If you want to protect customers and your business, you'll make less money, and vice versa. If you want to grow, you have to accept higher risk. But actually, when you focus on good outcomes for customers and your business, the FCA will approve, and your customers will be happier too. And we know that happier customers are more valuable. You'll attract more and keep them longer. We've seen it in our work many times. Here's a couple of examples. When we gave more prominence to a credit card's negative aspects, more people applied for one. When we added friction to help people buying breakdown cover to consider their options, more people bought it. And that's why back in 2023, before the implementation deadline, I proposed that firms would eventually recognise that the consumer duty was an opportunity and not just an obligation. And today we're seeing more demand from firms who genuinely have embraced that idea, as well as some who wish they'd fixed the roof while the sun was still shining. So finally, before I pass this to you, here are a few hot topics where the FCA has signalled that understanding is important. A consumer duty priority for this year is considering whether firms' digital tools sufficiently help consumers to understand credit agreements. In the FCA's market study into pure protection insurance, it wants to feel more confident that consumers understand the products they're buying. And then there's the emerging proposed idea of targeted support, a new tier designed to sit between guidance and advice, in which firms would be enabled to give non-advised consumers better support than they're getting now. That one's a really exciting one for me. I think the draft regulations are out very soon. People I've spoke to in the industry are also wondering, could this be a game changer? Will it reduce the advice gap? Possibly, but for it to work, we need to be confident that consumers can make effective decisions and act in their interests. So there's a huge, obvious reliance there on good consumer understanding. Okay, so for now, I'll pass over to Stu Tayler. Stu's our head of design. He's going to explain more about how you can approach it using qualitative research.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I realise that I'm doing a talk on understanding, and I'm probably setting myself up for a bit of a fall here. And I'm sure that there are bits of this webinar that aren't going to be explained as clearly as they could be. But anyway, as Stu says, I'm going to talk through our approach for how we test for consumer understanding. I'm sure there's lots of other methods, and I'll be interested to hear out how other people are doing it. But before we look at the how, I want to look at the who. By that I mean, who should decide if something is understandable? And the short answer is that if you've been involved in creating the communications, it's probably not you. But why is that? Well, you probably suffer from what's called the curse of knowledge. And so this is something that Steven Pinker describes in his book, The Sense of Style. And he says, the main cause of incomprehensible prose is the difficulty of imagining what it's like for someone else not to know something that you know. And he uses this cartoon from the New Yorker to illustrate his point. So on the left, you've got this policeman explaining directions that make complete sense to him. You know, he knows all the streets, so he's babbling away confidently. But the person on the right doesn't have that same knowledge, and so they're massively confused. But Pinker goes on to explain how to escape this curse of knowledge. And he talks about getting a feedback signal from the world of readers by basically giving people a draft, showing the draft to your intended audience. And this is at the heart of the method that I'm going to go through today. And it's where we take communications and we put them in front of people who are representative of those that are actually going to read it. And as Pinker says, it sounds banal, but it really is profound. And we do we do work with lots of different financial service firms, from banking to insurance to investments. And we see these profound, eye-opening moments all the time, you know, where clients go into some research confident that what's being tested is understandable, but then they come out with a very different point of view. And this is a quote from one of our clients after such research. So seeing this all played back really emphasizes the challenges end customers face. It truly brings to life the role we have in making our communications as customer focused as possible. And so today we're going to draw on our work for some of those clients as we go through. So again, I'm going to get into our approach, but I have one more thing to go through first. As I'm going to be talking a lot about comprehension and understanding, I want to spend a bit of time looking at what understanding is. So when you read something and you understand it, in your mind, you're building an overall representation of the meaning of that text. This is often called a mental model. And so you're not remembering the actual words, you're building a representation of the meaning. And actually that New Yorker cartoon that I showed earlier is a good way of describing mental models. So if the policeman had been communicating more clearly, the person listening to him would have built up a clearer matching mental model. Okay, so I'm going to run a bit of an experiment now with you all now. On the next page is a passage of text, and I just want you to read that text in your own time. I'm going to give people about 30 seconds, so there'll be some kind of dead air for a while. But yeah, just read it in your own time. Okay, I think that's coming up to 30 seconds or so. If you haven't made it all the way through, that's okay. So on the next page, what I'm going to do is give you a title and an image for that text. Okay, so this is based on a psychology study from the 90s. And I'm imagining that for most people, when they saw the title and that picture of the snowman, they would have experienced a kind of click of comprehension. And what's happening is that when you don't have the title and the image, it's really hard to build up a mental model of what's going on. So you can read the words, but they don't really make much sense. But then when you're given the title and an image, you're given this framework to build a mental model, and suddenly all the words seem to make more sense. And the reason that I'm talking about this is that when we test things, we're not looking at whether people can read and understand individual words. We're looking at whether they understand the underlying concepts of the text. Okay, so finally, we're going to get into the method of how we test comprehension. To do that, I'm going to work through an example document. So unfortunately, we're under NDA with a lot of our clients that we work with. So I've chosen to work through a pension statement from Scottish Widows, but I just want to be really clear that Scottish Widows aren't a client of ours, and we haven't actually tested this with any customers. And I'm going to work through the process in 5 steps. I'll spend most of my time on test creation and the research session, and then I'll whiz through the kind of final 3 steps. Also in the middle, just to break things up, I'm going to go through 3 comprehension issues that we typically see in our research. So first up is how we create the tests. So we start by taking the document, or it could be a digital experience, and we try and identify the underlying concepts that it's trying to communicate. So we're basically breaking up the document into different sections that represent different concepts. And to do that, we use the phrase, do people understand? And I'll show some examples just to explain that. So in the pension statement, it talks about how much money is in the pension plan today. So we want to learn, do people understand what money is in their pension plan? And what money is in their pension plan is the underlying concept there. In that same box, it also talks about the money the individual is paying in. And there's also a list of transactions a bit later showing what money is being paid in again. So we're looking to learn, do people understand what they have paid into their plan? And just a final one, there's a passage that talks about costs and charges. So we want to know, do people understand what any costs and charges are for? So at this point in the process, we begin to build a table where we've got a set of screenshots from the document and a list of the relevant concepts that we're going to test. So those do people understand concepts. During this stage, collaboration with our clients is really important. That's because Firstly, we need to check that we understand the concepts so that we can then assess whether other people understand them. But secondly, we need collaboration because we need to prioritize the concepts. So often we'll have a very long list of concepts to test, but our research sessions are usually only an hour. So we need to make sure that we focus our time on the most important things. And to help us prioritize, we look at two key things. Firstly, what's the information that people need to understand to be able to act? So typically you give someone a document because people need to make some kind of decision or they need to take some kind of action. And so that's what we're trying to home in on. What's the important information that people need to take action? In our pension statement, Scottish Widows want people to consider whether they're saving enough money for their retirement. So there's a section here where it talks about what would happen if you save more money. And we're looking at, do people understand what the impact would be if they saved more? And so that's key for people to understand so that they can then decide whether they need to take action or not. Another thing that Scottish Widows want people to do is to check whether they're invested in the right thing for their needs. Again, there's a section where it talks about how people's pension is invested and it lists the portfolio and the value. So therefore, we want to learn, do people understand what their pension is invested in? Because if it's not right for them, then again, they might need to take action. So the second thing we do to help prioritize the concepts is to look at what are the foundational concepts. So when you learn about a subject, you build on your prior knowledge. So you start with a topic, so that's that rectangle there, and you learn a set of things about that topic. And then as you receive more information, you organize that knowledge based on your prior knowledge. And then new information is organized according to that and so on. And you build up a kind of mind map or what's called a schema. And this is a bit of a simplification because as the model changes, the model actually changes as you kind of learn more. But the point is that prior knowledge is really important because if you don't have it, it's not just that piece of knowledge doesn't make sense. It's all the other concepts related to it. So no matter how well you explain these other bits, if the foundational knowledge isn't there, it will all fall apart. So going back to our pension statement in the previous example, you may remember that Scottish Widows want you to check whether you're invested in the right funds. But to be able to do that, you need to know what a fund is. So that's the foundational knowledge. Okay, so at this point, we've identified our underlying concepts, we've got our related screenshots, and we've also prioritized those concepts now. Next, we need to create a discussion guide for our research sessions, and for each concept, we'd write a set of questions to check comprehension. That's probably best explained by looking at the research sessions themselves. So moving on now, and this is really the meat of what we do. So we typically carry out qualitative research, and the main method is one-to-one interviews that we conduct remotely. And we recruit a small sample of people who are representative of the target audience. We then give them a document or interactive experience, and we give them a representative scenario to imagine. So for example, with the pension statement, we might ask them to imagine that they have a workplace pension with Scottish Widows and that they've received this statement in the post. And then we ask them to read the document as they typically would. And at certain points, we interject with questions. And in the interviews, we use three main methods to assess comprehension. So observation, playback questions, and exam style questions. We'll just look at each of those in turn now. So first is observation. And here we're looking out for things that people say and do that are unprompted by us. So we look at a few things. We listen for verbal cues. So that's where people say things like, I'm confused or I don't understand. We listen out for any utterances. So things like and and you have to pay close attention for those things. And we look out for non-verbal cues. So things like frowning or when people pause or where they just kind of adjust their posture and they may lean in. And again, you have to pay really close attention to spot those things. And then when you spot those things, you need to follow up with questions to understand what just happened. And I think this is why qualitative research is so useful, because a skilled facilitator can pick up on those things in a way that quantitative research just wouldn't. Okay, the second method for assessing comprehension is playback questions. So this is essentially where we get people to explain a concept that we've covered as if they're explaining it to a friend. So we'll look at a few examples again. So going back to that fund example, if we want to learn whether people understand what a fund is, we might ask them, can you explain to me in your own words what a fund is? So it's as simple as that, really. But we really emphasize that it needs to be in their own words, because when people don't understand something, often what they'll do is they'll find the information in the document and they'll just repeat it verbatim rather than giving their own interpretation. This is another example. So we might want to learn whether people understand how inflation will affect their pension money at retirement. So the first question we might ask would be, can you explain to me in your own words what inflation is? So we're looking for that foundational knowledge there. And then we might follow that up with, and how does that affect your pension? Okay, and then the third method for assessing comprehension is exam style questions. And this is a page from my daughter's English comprehension school book. And it shows the type of exam questions that we're talking about. So on the left, you've got a piece of text. And then on the right, there's a set of questions that a teacher will then mark. And the questions have clear and objectively right or wrong answers. So that's what we're trying to do in our research too. So looking at that pension statement, we want to learn whether people understand what money is in their pension today. So the exam question would be, how much is in your pension statement at the moment? And we can then check that figure against the figure in the document. So you can see there's an objectively right or wrong answer there. And here we want to learn whether people understand what money they, as an individual, have paid into their pension plan. So the exam question would be, how much have you paid into your pension? And this is an interesting one because the person in this case has been contributing to their pension through salary sacrifice, but that means the money is categorized as money added by their employer. So that's the box on the right, rather than money that you've been saving into your pension, which is on the left. So we want to check whether people realize that the money that they've been putting into their pension is actually part of the figure on the right. Anyway, those are the three methods we use to assess comprehension. But why do we bother using a mix of different methods there? So earlier, I explained that when someone understands something, they form a mental model that matches what's being communicated. But let's look at what happens when communication goes wrong. So the first thing that can go wrong is that people just don't form a coherent mental model. So essentially they're confused, but they know that they're confused. And that's when you'll hear people saying things like, I don't understand this. And if you ask them a playback question, they'll say, I don't know. But the second thing that can happen is that people do form a mental model, but it's just the wrong one. So here people think they've understood, but actually they haven't. And that's why we ask the playback questions and the exam style questions. And so it's miscomprehension rather than confusion that we're trying to pick up there. And it's miscomprehension that often can be a greater risk to organizations. Okay, so next up is analysis. I won't go through the analysis process in detail, but the thing I did want to focus on is the thing that's different to most typical qualitative research that we do, and that's scoring. So in our research sessions, we usually have a facilitator and then another researcher taking notes. And after each of those sessions, both researchers will assign a score for each concept based on the level of comprehension that they observed. We generally use a traffic light scoring system: green understood, orange partially understood, red not understood. And the orange is important there because people might understand parts of the concept, but not others, or they might not have full confidence in their level of understanding. And for each research participant, we assign the traffic light score for each concept, and then that builds up as we carry out more research sessions. And then at the end, we assign an average scoring for each concept. We do other analysis that I won't go into much detail on, but briefly, we analyze the transcripts, and for each concept, we have an overall summary finding. And we also look for themes across the different concepts. Okay, so I realize it can be a bit of a slog to go through a research process step by step. And as we're talking about issues, I thought we could break things up by talking about 3 of the common comprehension issues that we observe. So the first one is that often there's just too much information for people to process, and I'm aware I'm probably guilty of this now. So here's an example. This shows the documents that I received when I took out some temporary car insurance, and I received 3 documents, 24 pages. Too much information, it can lead to disengagement where people just don't bother reading, or it can lead to cognitive overload. So just let me explain what we mean by that term. When you're reading a document, you're using what cognitive scientists call working memory. And working memory refers to the systems that are used to both store and process information as you complete a task. But you can think of working memory a bit like a bookshelf, and the books that you put on the shelf are like pieces of information. And you can add more books onto the shelf, but gradually the shelf begins to fill up, and at a point the books start to fall off. We observe this in our research, so people stop recalling what they've seen earlier in a document, or they're unable to relate new information to what they've already seen. Or they generally just get overwhelmed and say things like, my brain's melting, which we've seen. And that's cognitive overload. Okay, the next common issue that we observe is assumed knowledge. And this is where the curse of knowledge that I talked about earlier is really exposed. And the most common way it's exposed is through jargon or technical terms. And this is an example from our pension statement, where it talks about things like units and portfolios and makes assumptions that the user understands these terms. Here's another example. It's from the Halifax app. Again, Halifax isn't one of our clients and we haven't tested this, but the page aims to help people explore their investment options. And then under Pick Your Own, it talks about shares, funds, and ETFs, which may be an unfamiliar acronym for some people. But this is quite an interesting example because for the Pick Your Own option, I assume that it's aimed at investors who are a bit more savvy, who have the capability to choose their own investments. So in this case, ETF may be an appropriate acronym. And that's the tricky thing about jargon, is whether it's jargon or not depends on your audience. And the only real way to know whether you're using appropriate language is through user research. Also, I believe it's easier for foundational knowledge to be assumed. I think for authors, new, tricky technical information is easier to spot as something that they need to explain, whereas the foundational concepts are more ingrained and a bit more hidden, so they're prime candidates for that curse of knowledge. Okay, the third common issue we see is burying important information. Journalists refer to this as burying the lead, and it's a bad practice where you have the main point of the article, which is called the lead, and it's buried within the body of the article. And we see that in documents we test where pertinent information is buried. This is an example from a mortgage illustration. So one of the key bits for people when they're taking out a mortgage and they're in this situation is, what are my monthly payments going to be? But here, all the information is presented at essentially the same level of importance. And I realise that, often here we're constrained by the regulation, but this is where those important monthly payments are actually shown. Again, it's presented at the same level of importance as everything else. Sometimes that's okay if people know what information they're trying to seek.
Yeah.
Not sure if there's any questions coming in.
Thanks for that, Stu. Yeah, so thanks Eric for the XKCD comic, which I hadn't seen before. If anybody's got any questions for Stu, put them in the chat. I just wanted to do a quick reflection. Also to say, I know that there's a lot of user researchers joining the webinar today who might be using similar methods. Firms ask us to lead research like this even when they have talented internal teams because we're independent. And they tell us it helps their conversations with the FCA supervisor if we've marked their homework using credible customer research. And I hope you can hear from Stu the difference between superficial testing and doing it credibly. And I've seen many big programs go awry because decision makers couldn't recognize the difference. big programs are exciting and there's always a bias towards good news. So when somebody senior asks, have you tested it? And they hear the answer is yes, then they take it as a big green flag. But you really need to think about, what did you test for? Did you test the right things? And how did you do it? Did you use the right methods? Because if you get that wrong, you risk spending a lot of time and money developing solutions that won't work because customers don't understand their options well enough. Okay, let's go to a few questions. Actually, there was a few people asked us this one in advance. I know we've had a chance to talk about this one, Stu. What you've described there is about doing sampling. How do you do that at scale?
Yeah, so this is like the Blue Peter thing of one I made earlier. So we have, been discussing a lot how we run an approach like this at scale, and it's something we'd love to put into practice. The research I described earlier is remote moderated research. So we have a researcher moderating the session, and we typically test with quite small numbers of participants in each round. And as I was explaining, hopefully that gives us a clear issue of understanding what the issues are, but also what's causing them. And that's because you can kind of watch and you're learning firsthand, and we can dig into things and be flexible with our test script to some degree. But to do this at scale, we'd undertake remote unmoderated research. This is where people are given the document and a set of tasks, but the researcher isn't present at the time. And that forces us to shift the balance of the type of questions that we ask. And we focus much more heavily on the exam style questions. And by doing that at scale, we'd give you more quantitative evidence and proof about what people do and don't understand. The downside is that it will give you less of an insight into why those issues are being caused. We also have another idea, but I'm going to save that for the next webinar.
Cool, thanks, Stu. Maybe this one's for the next webinar, or you could give it a try now. This is from Joe. An observation, maybe you'll address in the next webinar, conflict between explaining everything every time and keeping things short.
Yeah, I think that is going to be one for the next time, but I think it's a really important point, and we discuss it a lot, the difference between transparency and clarity, and that there's often a desire for transparency, but it can kind of backfire when you try and over explain everything. And so that's why that prioritization process is really important to understand. What do you really need to understand? What are the key things to understand?
Yeah, we've seen that a lot, haven't we? Where as a reaction to various things, firms seek to be more transparent because it's more ethical to do so, but you can get that wrong and you can make people more confused by putting too many books on the shelf.
Yeah. It'd be also a bit of a Pandora's box that once you kind of start explaining one thing, it leads to more things you could explain about that. And yeah.
Well, that's okay, Joe. I hope you can come back in a couple of weeks. Let me just check other couple of questions. Any tips from Andy Dykes on identifying foundational concepts? How do you decide which ones are the foundational concepts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think often it's when you look at it with a fresh eye. I mean, I think that's probably something as external researchers that we benefit from, is that we work with financial services regularly, but we're often not so embedded within an organization that we're kind of unaware of, we're not so victim to that curse of knowledge. So when we read something for the first time, it's kind of a bit easier to spot things like, I don't know, annuity or fund or portfolio that are common parlance in internal organizations.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to get right, isn't it? Because you need to understand those as a researcher. You need to understand the things that you're testing. Yet the more you understand them, the more risk there is that you will assume that everyone else understands them. So you need to flush your cash between pockets.
I mean, what we normally do is when we first receive a document or an experience is kind of just run through it with fresh eyes and just paste all the questions that we've got about it. And that's normally a really valuable exercise.
And a bit of guerrilla testing can help there as well, even just with a colleague who may not be such an expert. will readily throw up things that you've taken for granted. Another one, love the pension example. Does this type of testing work with printed or digital documents, or can it be a user journey?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I realize that the examples here were mostly around printed documents, but we do this research with digital journeys. One of the things I probably should have shown is we tested a digital journey where we were looking at usability through that journey, but also comprehension levels, and we kind of mapped comprehension levels across that journey. And because we're doing this in iterative rounds, we could kind of map the first round of research, and then we made changes, and then we could kind of map the difference in comprehension across the second round, and see where we'd kind of made improvements, or where things had got worse, or where there was still work to be done. So yeah, absolutely, it can work for digital journeys.
Cool, thanks, Stu. Another one, when it comes to testing, is there one method you would recommend above others?
I'm assuming you mean around those three methods for assessing comprehension. I think
Could be that.
probably the most useful one. Yeah, message back if that's not right, but probably the most useful method of the three is the playback questions, because it's just quite a useful catch for checking for that miscomprehension. So you'll just pick up where people have got things slightly wrong. And sometimes it can be hard to unpick that. You might have to kind of get them to repeat it a few times or explain it in a different way. And yeah, it's an interesting process trying to kind of unpack their mental model.
There's a possibility also that question, Stu, is about different sort of mixed methods approaches as well. And I know we've sort of highlighted in the webinar that ability in in-depth interviews to probe, to follow something you've observed that you don't get from other methods. And I'm just mindful that it can sound sometimes like we're criticizing other research methods, and I just want to say on record we're absolutely not. But you need to use mixed methods. We do find that maybe qualitative research gets overlooked more than quant. So we're just highlighting the things that it adds. Anything to say about that?
I mean, the only other thing is that I guess I tried to explain at the end there that the useful thing about qualitative research is that you get the insights as to why things are happening, and it kind of sparks ideas about how to solve them. So it's a kind of generative activity rather than just an evaluative one.
Cool. Thanks a lot. We don't have any more questions apart from one to say, thank you, enjoyed that. Some of my team couldn't make this time slot. Will a recording be shared that they can watch? And yes, the answer is yes. So we will be sharing a link to the recording very soon, perhaps today or certainly in the next few days. We'd love to hear your feedback on this session. If anything you found useful, if you've got questions, you want to talk to us, don't hesitate to get in touch. The next session is 2 weeks today, 2 o'clock on June the 4th. Anybody who's watching this live has already signed up. You registered for both, so you should already have the invite. If you want to extend the interview, the invitation to your colleagues or anybody that's watching this video afterwards, you can visit cxpartners.co.uk/events and you'll find the link there to sign up. Okay, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for coming along, and thanks for all your questions. Hopefully you learned something new, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.